to Friday night, the Radical Book Fair. I'm so excited about this panel and the sort of alchemy of coming together of these writers and their voices and thinking about place and cities. And Edinburgh is such an interesting physical phenomenon to exist in. And so we're going to be having a fascinating discussion that is going to be hosted by the wonderful Crystal Benz. I have a wee introduction for Crystal, and then afterwards, Crystal will be our host for the night, and we'll introduce our panelists. There will be time for audience questions at the end in the room and online. So if you have them, have your thinking caps on. Crystal Benz is an Edinburgh-based visual artist and writer whose work interrogates how power, whether political, financial, or technological, is expressed in the world. Please welcome Crystal, Dan, Morag, and Mason.
Is this on? Yeah, great. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Cities Reclaimed, Dismantling Geographies of Oppression. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with our esteemed panel with Mason Leaver-Yap, Morag Rose, and Dan Hicks. And I'll just give a brief introduction to the session and bios for our three panelists, and then they will have a few minutes to introduce their books and their work to you, and then we'll have a discussion among the three of us for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up for your questions for the last 15 minutes. I will make sure to give everyone a kind of warning when I'm at the last question, so you can think of your questions for the panelists. So we're here to talk about how our built environment has a lot to tell us about the political narratives of our cities, who is welcome, who is safe, who's forgotten, who's hidden. And we have our three panelists here with their three different books, which discuss the histories and politics of the cities around us, how they shape us, and how we shape them. Diving into built histories of women's rights, art as resistance, legacies of colonialism, class and enslavement. We're going to be speaking tonight about how we want to shape our cities for the future. So I'm going to firstly hand over to Dan just to introduce their work, and then we'll hear from Morag and Mason after that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much. It's so wonderful to be here. And, what a wonderful mix of people, for this conversation about the built environment and the politics of it. So I wrote a book that's called Every Monument Will Fall. It's not called All the Monuments Must Fall. It is an observation that we really need to think more in this country and internationally about what elsewhere in the world is sort of thought about in terms of memory culture. How do we shape memory? So when it comes to the grassroots movements, indigenous-led movements, African-led movements that relate to the legacies of imperialism, there are three movements that have rocked up at the front door of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, where I work as a museum curator, but also many institutions around the world as well, which are like them here in Edinburgh, the museums and the universities as well. So that's the movement for restitution and the restitution of sort of looted objects. It's the movement for a fallism, for the removal of the legacy monuments from imperialism, and it's the movement for the attempts to alter knowledge and to look towards the decolonization of our disciplines. So whether it's in the streets for statues, whether it's in the museums for artifacts, or whether it's in the libraries, in the seminar rooms, or actually environments like this one, where we're thinking about ideas, all those movements, it seemed to me, are responding to a certain sort of a period of time, a certain aesthetic, a certain sort of movement in itself that emerged in between the 1870s and the 1920s, fascist movement that sought to use art and culture in order to naturalize certain forms of white supremacy, cultural, supremacy, the idea of the civilized versus the so-called sort of savage or the barbarous. And so really what the book sort of looks at is it sort of listens to, and it looks at the histories of all those movements. I mean, the Fallism movement sort of reaches back 100 years in India. It has important histories in Algeria, the Rhodes Must Fall movement that arrived in Oxford in 2015 was part of a movement where Rhodes has already fallen in Zambia at independence in 1964, in Zimbabwe in 1980 at independence, in South Africa in 2015, and the unfallen status of Rhodes, because it is there in Oxford, even though there has been a decision in the college that it should be removed, it hasn't been removed. Why not? How interesting it is that it's so hard to actually make these changes. At the heart of the book is a history of the abuse of a human being, the head of someone that was sort of turned into a cup that was used, as a lot of you might have read about in The Guardian earlier this year, was sort of used in the dinner rituals in an Oxford college. So I try in the book fundamentally to hold up that unnamed, anonymized, abused woman, her body in the college, up against those named men who get themselves remembered in the form of a monument or have their name above the door of a museum, of a named museum like the one I work in. Fundamentally, the book is about the politics of not only who we remember and who we don't, but how our memory is erased, how a memory is sort of held on to, and what is the democratic right? How do we think about the right that any institution, any society, any group or city has to reshape its memory culture? So that's at the heart of the book, really.
I also realized I completely skipped our speaker bios. So before Morag kicks off, I was just so excited to get into the conversation. I do feel it's helpful for the audience to have a little bit of context. So I'll just do Dan's quickly. Dan Hicks is Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at the University of Oxford, curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and a fellow of St. Cross College, Oxford. He's written widely on art, heritage, museums, colonialism, cultural memory, and the material culture of the recent past and the near present. Which, if you didn't know that'll make sense of the book project that he's just described. Morag Rose is a walking artist, activist, and academic. She is founder of the Loiterers Resistance Movement and a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Mason Leaver-Yap works with artists to create publications, exhibitions, and events. He has recently been working with Renee Green, Alexis Kyle Mitchell, Ingrid Pollard, Emma Abaziokan, and Phil Collins. He is currently writing on ruination. So Morag, do you want to introduce us to your work, please?
Yeah, so thanks for the invite and for everyone giving their time. I'm really super excited to be on the panel with such interesting and important work. So yeah, I'm a walking artist, activist and academic, as you just said, the kind of awkward title I give myself. I've tried to put all that into my book, which is called The Feminist Art of Walking, and it celebrates women who have transformed the kind of everyday act of walking into some extraordinary performances or acts of resistance and defiance. And there's some women in the book in the audience today, and I'm super glad to see that. Just to be really clear, the feminism in my book is absolutely intersectional and trans-inclusive, and the walking in my book welcomes all bodies. I want an expanded kind of walking where everyone is able to be involved, because I link it really to the importance of public space and kind of civic society, really. So anyway, I'm going to just read from the beginning. So, I am a loiterer. I am the Loiterers Resistance Movement. Once a month, every month, for around 20 years now, I've stood on my own somewhere in Manchester and I've loitered. I'll put out an invitation for anyone interested to come and explore our city with me. Then I wait to see who will turn up. We walk together not following a map, but letting ourselves drift. Maybe we'll use playing cards, or Anne knows miles away. I don't ever know where we will go or what we will discover. I am a loiterer because I want to have conversations with and about the streets that we live in. I am a loiterer because I'm curious. I want to explore and ask awkward questions. I am a loiterer because I want to make creative mischief and subversive new maps. I am a loiterer because I cherish serendipity and the poetry of the pavement. I am a loiterer because everyone and everywhere is interesting and mostly good. I'm a loiterer because I want to challenge the forces trying to divide and segregate us, and I really wish that didn't feel more relevant than when I wrote this last summer. I'm a loiterer because I like to take my theory for a walk, to test it out, give it a spin. I'm a loiterer because I collect stories to share with the city that I love. I'm a loiterer because once I was lonely, and now I am not. And the people who walk with me are friends, even if only for an afternoon. I'm a loiterer because I want to play out, be silly, be surprised, and open to what's around every new corner. I'm a loiterer because I believe public space matters and it should be open, accessible, and free for everyone to enjoy. I'm a loiterer because if we don't use these spaces, we will lose something more precious than we realise. I'm a loiterer because I walk myself painfully, clumsily, tenaciously into being here. And so now I am part of this city. It belongs to me now. I'm a loiterer because I can, and I want to hold space open for those who can't yet. I'm a loiterer because I believe walking can change the world.
Thank you both, and thanks. It's amazing to see so many people here. Like, the Radical Book Fair is like one of my favourite festivals, and Lighthouse Books is one of my favourite places to do like anything. So, yeah, thank you to the panel too. It's really nice to hear a little bit more about your books, and looking forward to getting into it. I'm in a kind of funny situation of having a book in which my writing does not appear. It's a collection of other people's works. A lot of the authors are actually already out on tables. It's people like Dean Spade, Lola Olufemi, Winnie Herbstein, and Kirsten Lloyd, Hannah Proctor. But there's one person who doesn't have any books out apart from In Slamming Doors, and that's the housing activist Cathy McCormack. She passed away in 2022, and the book that I made with Winnie Herbstein, Slamming Doors, is dedicated to Cathy. It gathers a lot of her work that she did around, I guess, trying to organise better housing across the Easter Hall region of Glasgow, which is in the East End. And her kind of activism was wide-ranging. Like, when you delve into her archives, it moves between, like, Palestine, John Pilger, climate change. And for that reason, I thought it would be nice to bring Cathy's voice into the room by reading a little bit of an interview that Winnie did with Cathy shortly before she passed away. If you end up picking up the book, you'll see that a lot of it is written just as Cathy speaks. And as somebody who's from the East Coast, not the West Coast, I am not going to impersonate her. So bear with me. But this is it was an extended interview where Cathy talks about the history and her memory of doing things. And I think, as we've heard from the other panelists, like, what is remembered and also the things that are maybe remembered in other places other than museums takes on a different set of values. So hopefully I can kind of bring Cathy with us a little bit tonight. And this is what Cathy says. I mean, the work that the East Hall Residents Association did is actually a very good model for development, because although we had the damp housing, we had the fuel poverty, we had the sick children, and that's how we were looking to look at tackle the cause of the dampness, the health. we realised that our district council was just treating the symptoms. So basically what they were doing was that they told us to wash the fungus off the walls with bleach, which we did. However, we did not realise that when you wash the fungus, it releases all the spores. We didn't realise that we were breathing the spores in. And so at that particular time, we knew there's obviously something not right. We weren't sure, but at the actual cause of the health issues, and I, as part of the dampness group, we were really concerned. The dampness group started doing door-to-door survey to find out the extent of the dampness problem. Now, East Hall is only part of Greater Easterhouse, so there's 15 areas at the time, and East Hall was one. So we're talking about maybe a population of 3,000. 3,000 people, and most of their houses had some form of dampness. But we also started hearing stories about children having to use inhalers, children on steroids, and we thought, this is even more serious than we thought it was. So I can't even remember really what the process was, but we definitely had a key worker, a community worker, or basically, I realise now what was the problem. The problem is nobody would listen to us. And so we realised that we would need to come up with the evidence to show that it wasn't the tenants who were causing the dampness, but the houses. We joined the Technical Services Agency, which was tenant-controlled, and it was only £1 to join. That gave us access to architects, quantity surveyors, who then go in and do a survey of the structure of the housing. And in turn, maybe there was a dozen houses, all different orientations, south-facing, west-facing, mixed Wilson block. We had these. And so it was looking at every construction. They were able to measure. They put probes in the houses. Like my house was wired up, and what they were trying to do basically was to find out how much it would cost tenants to heat a 3-apartment flat. The rate of heat loss. So basically, to cut a long story short, they estimated that to keep the houses, let's rephrase that question. So what they realised, they identified that most of the houses were suffering from condensation dampness. And that's why the district council's response was, supposedly the tenant's fault. We were either no heating our house enough, we were having too many baths, we were boiling too many kettles, there was a draft coming in the letterbox. They came up with every conceivable blaming tactic. And we just thought, hold on a wee minute. If we can't boil a kettle, if we can't breathe, have a bath, and do all the things that normal families do, then there must be something wrong with the houses, not with the people that live in them. And basically that's what happened. And so we estimated in Easterhouse there was maybe 75,000 people living in Easterhouse, Greater Easterhouse. 75,000. That's the size of a city. It's the size of Perth. It had the same population. And we estimated that between us, we were spending £1 million heating the sky above Easterhouse. And that's when it clicked about climate change. That's when we made the links between our sick houses, our sick children, and the sickness of the planet. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for the amazing introduction to the books and to your work. So I wanted to just start us off with Dan and Mason. You've already touched on the issue of memory culture a little bit, but I wanted to start us off with a fairly broad question, maybe asking for your reflections on the place of memory culture in our cities in relation to your work. And actually, it was the thing that in part prompted this question was the mention, Dan, in your book of the connection between Grenfell Tower and the name of Grenfell Tower. And I hadn't actually realized that Grenfell Tower was named after Grenfell Road, which is named after Field Marshal Lord Grenfell, who was, not a particularly nice, classic 19th century British imperialist. So I think you talk about monuments and museums and knowledge culture, but also there are other connections in our cities. Morag, we spoke a bit about the basement, this formative anarchist space, and the remembrance of these kind of spaces, or the forgetting of them. And Mason, in your book, I was thinking specifically around Take Root, the Glasgow-based women's activist housing co-op, an attempt to build houses, and thinking again of archiving and remembering that. So either speak to those particular things or more generally reflections on the place of memory culture in your work.
Okay, thanks so much. The Grenfell link is I think an important one to underline. He was an imperialist after whom, a chunk of West London which, of course, was, is now a site for remembering racialized violence in relation to housing, in relation to, how we live, in the present, and, who dies and who lives and who is sort of treated as human. And it turns out that the man after whom, the tower is named, returned after the Battle of Ulundi in 1879, which is the first sort of use of the machine gun in an African war, in a war against, of these sort of wars which I write about a fair amount in the book. And he returned to the site sort of 2 years later and dug up a skull of a Zulu warrior or a chief, which he had shot, and he sort of kept it on his mantelpiece in his sort of country house. What does that mean? I mean, what sort of link is that? What sort of endurance, what sort of persistence of violence is that re-emerges with that name again in sort of 2017? I think it's real. I think there are links. There are persistences in our built environment that relate to who gets named and who doesn't, that relate to the history of land tenure and the issues that come up in sort of your book about actually how we live and where we live, but also how we inhabit the city, fundamentally how we write about it. And so ultimately the way that the book came out was in a way that sort of didn't only talk about naming and unnaming, but also it sort of tried to get at who is sort of treated as human and what are the processes of sort of dehumanization. And so sort of Sylvia Winter's work on what she calls monohumanism was incredibly important. But also it isn't only the nouns, it isn't only the names, it's also the pronouns. I mean, and so we know that sort of pronouns are important in so many ways, but it's important with the I and the we. We can use that word we can talk about our cultures, our cities, our museums, our heritage, and who is actually that sort of word that seems to sort of mean that everyone's involved actually is a word that can keep people out in all sorts of ways. So the book ended up being written in the vocative, so the second person sort of came up. There's a lot of you in the book, and the you moves around in between various people that I went on walks with, and that I worked with, and I think that is a moment of sort of overlap in between our works, in between our books, in that we're writing about memory, but we're trying to decenter ourselves in that sort of process, and we're trying to look at how memory might be reshaped as well as simply inherited. Those people that say that that you can never sort of unname a building or never topple sort of monument are allowing us to imagine that we're living in a very weird, extreme version of Freudian involuntary memory, where the memories that are forced upon us by some sort of Victorians are things we always have to have. And of course, we can actually reshape our memory cultures, and we can do it together.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think in my book there is a definite theme of what we remember and what the stories that we tell about places and to each other, how we make sure that they are genuinely diverse and complex and contradictory and making place for the many different versions, because so a lot of my work has been based in Manchester, and the story the city tells itself is incredibly boring, frankly, and one-dimensional and not honest. And I love the city for the mess and the chaos and the many complicated things. And so part of my work has been a kind of negotiating how we remember but also treasure the fact that the city is always in flux, because certainly, we know that nostalgia gets operationalized for all kinds of terrible ends, and we see these contradictions throughout the landscape in Manchester. So, for example, Piccadilly Gardens, which is, forgive my language, generally regarded as a bit of a shithole for multiple reasons. But actually, it's not my most academic term, but I think it's problematic. A lot of the criticism is heavily racialised and heavily classed and ignores that it is a genuinely free space and that lots of it is sold on. But more importantly, when I talk to women, they will go, well, those images of the gardens when it had flowers in looked lovely for one day in 1956 when somebody made a postcard, but actually it felt really unsafe. And they're not nostalgic for that past. And the people who are rightly fighting against gentrification and the erosion of working class histories absolutely understand and appreciate that mills were not good places to work in and they were implicated in the slave trade and worse. And so trying to balance and reckon with this it's a constant issue. And there's also, on a personal level, so my book is not, it is first person, and I did name lots of people because it was also a very conscious bringing in the many amazing artists I know, because a lot of books, particularly on psychogeography and on walking art, are just in the usual suspects. And I'm not arguing against the canon, there's some good stuff there, but why is it so boring and so narrow? It's about opening doors, right? And maybe asking those awkward questions. And I guess the final thing I'd say about physical memorials, so I'll keep this brief and I'll try and suppress my anger, but there was a really big campaign for a long time for a Peterloo Memorial in Manchester, and I hugely supported that campaign in lots of ways, and I still respect the individuals involved, because Peterloo, you know, important in terms of, you know, democracy and working class history, all kinds of reasons why. But when the council finally agreed to build a memorial instead of, you know, the annual reading of the dead and these kinds of things, Jeremy Deller designed what was essentially a flight of steps. And as a disabled person, and knowing that people were disabled by Peterloo, it's just disgusting and despairing that we have a flight of stairs as a memorial. And we fought against that a lot, and it was really complicated. And ultimately, sometimes we have to acknowledge failure. I don't want to be nostalgic about campaigns when you meet brilliant people and you do brilliant things, you don't always win. But it's there as this kind of constant reminder that our city has so many barriers. And it is multiply complicated, and I'd much rather we'd carried on remembering Peterloo by naming the dead, by telling those stories, by doing all those things, rather than doing that. It's bad. I will just say, if anyone's in Manchester, that disabled people do ask as a show of solidarity, please do not climb the memorial. Like, find other ways to honour Peterloo, because there are many, and climbing the stairs is just not one of them. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a really incredible point. I think this kind of question, I mean, Morag, you mentioned like the mess and actually preserving the mess and archiving the mess, making sure that it's not just kind of neatly narrated from a kind of single viewpoint is so important, particularly like when it comes to the question of Grenfell, for example, which is a history that is still unfolding. It's like a legacy that we live within. And one of the kind of things I think that when Winnie Herbstein, my co-editor, was trying to put together all of these different archives when we were kind of thinking about the memory, she was involved in digitizing some of the archives, trying to improve access. So rather than necessarily tidying things up, maybe kind of adding to them. And Crystal, you mentioned the Take Root Collective. So for those that might not know, Take Root Collective was a women's self-build collective in Glasgow that operated, I guess, from the 1990s to the early 2000s. And actually, while I think that we could be like thinking about like, well, what did Take Root build? Like, where can we go and see these things? I was really struck when Morag was talking about this idea of like, what is the right memorial? Like, who does the memorial represent? It's actually when we kind of build things, we're actually building more than just bricks and mortar. There's building relations, and there's also like having conflict and trying to do conflict in different ways. And I think if you look at the archives and the papers of Take Root, many of which are reproduced as facsimiles in the book, but you can go to the Glasgow Women's Library and check out the archives there. Actually, you see people doing things differently in really inspiring and interesting ways. And one of the things that I guess Winnie and I were talking about, and one of the reasons to invite Hannah Proctor to write to the book. You might know Hannah's work. She wrote an amazing book called Burnout, The Emotional Experience of Political Defeat. Hannah had some unfinished business that didn't work its way into Burnout. There were, and we were really interested in kind of troubling that unfinished business, that messiness. And that's a little bit to do with why is it that collectives are so thrilling to be a part of at the beginning, and sometimes they either burn out in an incredible blaze of glory, or they just kind of quietly disappear. And one of the questions of slamming doors that I guess we try to propose some solutions for as well is, how is conflict in collectives represented? And the housing crisis is a great place to look at various forms of conflict because the stakes are so high. But actually, like, looking at archives for the ways in which certain things go missed, you know, that during periods of conflict in collectives, maybe the minutes aren't so neat, maybe certain voices aren't represented, maybe this is one of the reasons why it's really difficult to kind of learn from these things. So maybe we kind of need to kind of go back into the archives with a kind of messiness in mind. I think this is something that Hannah really poses very well as a kind of as a researcher, as a historian, as somebody who is actually promoting a way of looking that isn't just kind of tidying everything away. You know, and I definitely kind of feel that these two examples, you know, of Grenfell and Peterloo are examples of exactly how kind of careful we need to be as researchers, as publishers, as writers, as like pointing to the problems and admitting them and like trying to figure out different ways of coming at them. And I think that's part of the thing that's kind of interesting about sharing. It's like, well, presumably there's more than one way to do this.
If we have time, I really want to come back to this question of how to have conflict together, because I think there's some there's an interesting conversation we could have. It's also a title of one of the chapters in Slamming Doors, taken from a contribution by Dean Spade. But I wanted to ask you, maybe particularly Dan and Morag, to elaborate a little bit specifically on walking and on the power of walking together in community as a way of reclaiming ownership of cities and urban spaces, but also of like producing our own knowledge collectively about cities. And one of the things, again, that particularly struck me, Morag, in, I think it was your Manchester chapter, is you mentioned that, like, I think it was the entirety of Manchester city centre is covered by a public space protection order, which kind of blew my mind. And again, so I also wanted to ask if you could maybe, I think you said the street is one of the few places that everyone can access for free. So I really hoped that you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that. And then also, yeah, if Dan, if you wanted to speak about walking too, that'd be great.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So yeah, that kind of access thing, this is still very much a thought in process here about the idea of a right to roam and to be in space as a way that we kind of dwell together and sometimes like negotiate difference or realize, like, thinking back about, you know, if you're indoors staring at a screen all the time, to put it really simply, you know, we all get more and more alienated. We know that there's a lot of tough times. Actually just going out and realizing that, you know, that person down the road is not scary. They're actually all right. You're both waiting for the same bus and the bus is rubbish, and that's another story. But, you know, I think that we need to really value these everyday spaces every bit as much as a right to roam in the countryside. And I'm not anti-countryside, obviously, but I'm very sceptical of this idea that just being out in nature is this amazing epiphany, because, you know, if you've got a hole in your sock or your feet hurt or, you know, you've taken a long time to get there, it doesn't work. So we need to think about these everyday spaces, because actually, frankly, if we're not, they'll get covered in flags. You know, I think that actually the very simple thing of walking and being open to others in that space, even if you don't particularly like how they smell or how they look or whatever, but actually just being is in itself a powerful thing. And it should not be an act of resistance, and it should not be radical to go for a walk. But we know for all kinds of reasons at all kinds of times, for many of us, just being in space is problematic. And, you know, I have, you know, as a white woman, I can definitely know that there are some places I've been able to go that other people wouldn't. And I know as I've got older, it's changed. And there's multiple reasons for that, and they range from those material things of lack of all the infrastructures of pavements, of toilets, of bus stops, to, you know, the harassment that we face. And I think that to walk should be a fundamental right. And just to reiterate, that doesn't just mean with two legs. And I do just something I meant to add with the earlier bit about memory. I'm not saying anything new here either, and I'm following on from many other women and activists who have used that power of physically being in the street. I mean, we know it, or to do something creative with their walk to make it more interesting, because playing a game in a street that's entirely made for shopping or commerce or whatever, it's a small moment of joy and connection that is sadly resistant, but let's enjoy it. Let's make those moments of enchantment, because we know that that's something we can keep, and we can, even if it's only fleeting, like it's something to hold with you and remember. And those small acts of solidarity kind of add up at a time when it feels hard to do the big things. So I don't think it's just enough on its own, but I think it's one powerful tactic. And just briefly, the Public Space Protection Order, sorry, I forgot the actual question. It's this bit of legislation, you know. I get really bored that I spend a lot of my life talking about policy, because actually it does set a tone. And the Public Space Protection Order in Manchester and many other places does things like say, you can't have a tent in public. And we know what that's signalling. You know, there's this cold big dog whistles, and there's stuff around public urination at a time when there are no public toilets. And we know that, you know, toilets are used to control people, to control gender, to stop people with leaky or disabled bodies or chronic illness being able to be out in public. And that's why I think we need to keep using streets. We need to view them as valuable spaces. And actually, I talk about the street. It's not about a path. It's about the space. It's everything for everyone. And if we don't use it and model it, then we will lose it. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, it's really, really important work. And I think, you know, you sort of hinted at something earlier about what sort of your work, but also all this sort of important work that's emerging about, you know, leftist walking. That, you know, walking is emerging, you know, I think is a very, very important theme. And it's moving away from, you know, that sort of Ian Sinclair, you know, Will Self, Robert Macfarlane, if I dare, sort of point that out. Those modes of walking that obviously we know are sort of problematic because of their whiteness, because of their cis masculinity, because of their ableism, and so on. Walking, it seems to me, is emerging as a practice that can not only be the flaneur who walks around in order to keep things the same, but it can be an intervention. It can be a way of actually, you know, changing our cities. And that goes to the heart, I think, of how the walks in my book work, because we're told often that that our built environment is sort of something that can never change. It can't change, because if you're going to alter, you know, the name of something, if you're going to alter the memory culture, then you're cancelling history. You're rewriting history. Of course, every historian knows that there's all history is rewriting history. I mean, otherwise you're just going to repeat the same old narrative. But interestingly, it comes sort of down to really, you know, technical laws in relation to local authorities, a bit like, you know, you were talking about. It comes down to listed building consent. It comes down to this sort of weird world we live in, where the politics of the really, you know, boring sort of process via which tens of thousands of listed buildings sort of every year are changed, and our built environment's always changed, and our historic sort of cities have always got sort of cranes up and sort of things are being torn down. And so, of course, the world's always changing. Really, it's about sort of how it changes. And it might be that in intervening, in walking, in inhabiting the city in different ways, that we can help to, you know, not only read it differently, but also changes in different ways.
Can I say one brief thing? I do think that figure of the flaneur, that never existed, is the most damaging thing. Actually, not just because of those attributes, but because they're an isolated individual that allegedly doesn't touch and is not touched. And that idea of the lone individual when we're all constellations is, I just think, really damaging. So, yeah, thanks for what you said. And
Mason, do you want to add anything around walking?
I mean, not necessarily, but I think that maybe it's a question, like a wider question of, this word access, and I think that we can kind of talk about access in all different forms of kind of technicalities and stuff, but actually, like, access is just about how we come into connection with either knowledge or other people in ways that are meaningful, right? So, how do we access, like, affordable healthcare? How do we access affordable housing? How do we access our streets? It's like, a lot of this stuff feels like it should be straightforward, and yet we have to navigate it with, I guess, kind of sometimes labyrinthine bureaucracy, which is not always necessary, and sometimes bureaucracy is an incredibly powerful tool, right? That is a bit of a bulwark against kind of swift, sudden changes. But I think that for take root, like one of the questions was like, how does one access the information through which one can afford housing? A lot of the people in Take Root had spoken of like being unhoused or bad landlords, and there was like an idea of like actually kind of starting from the ground up. How do you imagine something alternatively? One of the things that we managed to get access to was these incredible floor plans that all the members of Take Root constructed. They each kind of imagined their own dream home, and then they're all put in the book as like potential like blueprints. That these are models. They don't have to necessarily only be in the imagination. And it's like, how then do we like access each other and access resources through which these things can be made? And the difficulty of trying to kind of see things now, I think, can often be resolved by looking just a little bit back. Like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. Like, a lot of people have already been there and done that. It might be a different time, but actually, like, the findings are really, really interesting. And it's important to kind of hold those people up and celebrate them. A win is a win.
How are we doing for time? Okay, we're 6:30. I can't see my timekeeping person. Okay. I will ask one last question to our distinguished panel, and so please have a think, get your questions ready, and then we'll open it up for a couple of questions. So we're going to skip the conflict question, which is sad, so I'll have to ask you about that later. But we were talking before we started about how the built environment can be harmful or how it can be hopeful. And I think we've talked probably a bit more about the harmful side. And so as a last question to you, I really want to ask about the hopeful side and imagining these, like Mason, what you were just saying, like the power of imagination and the role of imagination in terms of the hope for like how we can collectively construct the cities that we want. So maybe to speak a little bit about hope and the power of imagination as the last question.
Sure. Okay. Well, and so maybe I can go first. And I think the hope when it comes to fallism and to restitution and to the decolonization of knowledge really lies in intergenerational politics. And that observation, which I was really surprised by as I wrote the book, that it turns out that it takes 40 to 50 years for a monument to fall or for an object in a museum to be returned. The first movement for the return of the Benin bronzes, which was what I wrote my last book about, for which we are label mates. The Pluto book that I did about returning the Benin bronzes, the first items in that case were returned as early as the 1930s, when the campaigns around the 100-year anniversary of that attack sort of arrived in the late 1990s. There was a sense that the campaign had failed because things were not going back, but then a new generation came along and items were being returned. The same for fallism. I mean, Colston in Bristol. I mean, I'm old enough to have been a part of, to have been there in the late 90s at the point at which actually, last time that we attempted to remove Colston, And again, I mean, my generation felt that we had sort of failed in the noughties when we attempted to go through all the boring sort of processes with English heritage as it then was, and at every moment it was sort of prevented, but then a new generation comes along. So that intergenerational sort of politics, that observation that you need to sort of keep these things moving is where the hope lies. I use in the book an Emily Dickinson sort of poem where she talks about the crumbling of something as not being an instant act, that things can... Because really, I mean, archaeology is the science of duration. It's the science of how things, survive. And so unlike historians, we don't sort of only ask what happened in the past, but as we're reading the present, we have to say, well, how has this thing been made actually to endure? So when you see monuments and museums and sort of universities and the publishing industry and all sorts of things as sort of ways of sort of keeping things going, that's where the fight is as well, and that's where the hope is for activism. Fundamentally, for me, the fight relates to thinking about who is human and who isn't. When you walk around a city and you're presented with what Frantz Fanon called the world of statues, the immobile world that seems like it's never going to change, with the figures rendered, the guy on the horse with his gun, or the object in the museum that feels like it's never going to be returned. The hope has to be there, that we can care for people more than we care for things, and that can inform art and culture, but also all other parts of living in cities.
So my hope is absolutely in the streets and in people and in that idea of, desire lines. Like, we walk in the footsteps of people who went before, other people walk in our footsteps, and that makes a walk, right? And no matter how hostile the city, people will make space for solidarity and love and all those things and they will repurpose space. And you see it everywhere, rope swings to hopscotches or whatever, and that gives me hope because we will prevail and we will make those things happen. And I also think that when I talk about, walking art, one of the beautiful things about it is it's for everyone. You don't need formal I don't have any training. I wasn't allowed to do art at school. And, I think everyone can, in that spirit, be an artist and be creative. And those spaces of imagination that are opened up when you do something different to break through your space is actually where we start or carry on having those dreams. And we need those dreams more than ever, I think, because, again, it's not enough. We need multiple fights. But I ultimately do have my faith and my hope in people and the public and the spaces.
Yeah, I think that question of like not having a dream happen and then move on to the next one, or not just having an imagination about something, but like realizing that maybe there's like patterns across time of the same dream happening again and again, but maybe in different accents or different places. And one of the kind of key things that I was talking about with Winnie when we were trying to develop the book was like actually thinking about like, okay, so this on some level is like maybe could be considered an art book or a user manual of some kind. But actually one of the things that it was really interested in was redistribution and dissemination. So the dissemination of the archives and of the ideas, redistribution of also like funds as well as ideas. So one of the things that's kind of really interesting about it is the book came out of the sale of works to the University of Edinburgh art collection, and that sale then funded the rent for a feminist welding collective in Glasgow called Slag Hammers. Slag Hammers owes much of its like life and structure and kind of ideals to things like Take Root, to these other kind of self-build collectives, and also like other kind of mutual aid structures, and then also like the idea that some of the funding towards the book and some of the sales of the book would also go towards Cathy McCormick's community fund. So trying to like think actually in ways that are in solidarity with the things that you're trying to talk about. Like, it's not just this symbolic idea that you're like, oh, I just want to write about this. It's like, well, actually, I want to like participate in this. And actually, like, maybe there's like ways in which we can kind of think about ourselves, reinforcing each other's dreams rather than just like going off and having our own one. And I think that that's probably the most exciting thing for me. For us.
Thank you so much. It was such an incredibly fascinating conversation, and especially beautiful final answers around hope. How are we doing in terms of questions? Have we got time for a few? We've got time for a few questions. Okay. Who has questions for our panel?
Right, I'm going to steal this, and I realized seamless. Sorry, guys. Where was the hand? There we go. It's like the cable is not that long.
Thanks very much, everyone, for such a brilliant talk and discussion. So many threads between the three books, but also, I think, between your sort of fields of expertise, if I can call it that. I'm alert that you've all been working in your fields for quite some time. And Morag, you talk about the Loiterers Resistance Movement as being 20 years in practice. So I guess I wanted to ask whether from your, not to suggest that progress is not contested, nor that it's linear. I wanted to know what your perspective was on that sort of personal duration of time that you've been working on monuments, objects, archaeology, artefacts, Loiterers Resistance Movement, and collectives and collaborations. Where are we? Are we in a better place? Are we in a worse place? Are we just in a different place? I just think you might have insights into the change of movements over the long duration. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Maybe I'll go first. Yeah. There's always a risk that we're going to see around the time of the midterms an attempt to put Robert E. Lee or another one of the Confederate images, back on its feet and back on display. These are issues for us in the UK as well. Outside Museum of London Docklands, you saw the Milligan statue removed in, actually a week after, or sort of days after Colston. But that image had already been removed in the Second World War, and then it was re-erected after Maggie Thatcher invested, set up the corporations for investing in that, in all the Docklands and the banking sector and so on. It was sort of felt it was a good idea to put that image sort of back up in 1999, and then it took another 21 years for it to come down. So, and actually, it sort of remains in the basement of the museum now. So, of course, there's always the risk there. So we just have to make sure that we look at what counts as a monument, what counts as a form of memory. It can be ideas, it can be gestures, it can be the framing, it can be who's sort of taking up space, who's making the decisions. But yeah, I think it is. I think we've won the arguments on restitution, but we now need to move into a conversation over openness about how many ancestral human remains we have in our museums. We don't know, and there's a lot of work, important work that's going on from the All-Party parliamentary group. Bel Ribeiro Addy, Paul Botang are really leading on that. There's going to be a lot coming up, in the coming months on that. So yeah, we just need to. But I think there is hope, though. Yeah, as we were saying.
I'm going to hand over to you first, because I feel like we're in a really linear way, and it doesn't seem to suit the question. So if you don't mind.
Yeah,
sorry,
sure.
didn't spring that on you.
Yeah, I think this kind of question of progress and the duration of progress is really hard. I mean, what I can say is that the progress of capital is devastating. And I think what we're kind of seeing is the need for people to be more nimble in the ways that they kind of think about how they tackle that question of the problem of progress. You can say that there's been progress in terms of the housing crisis because we're deeper in it. But I think that within that, and maybe this is the kind of the point, is to actually kind of go into conflict with progress. And part of going into conflict with progress is actually kind of resolving how we do conflict with each other. Like one of the kind of the key texts in the book is from Dean Spade, who's got an amazing book out right now called Love in a Fucked Up World, which is a kind of, in some ways, a self-help book, but actually what Dean kind of writes in Slamming Doors is more of an extension of mutual aid in terms of like how do we work in groups and how can we work better together. And so like that's where I would like to see progress. One of the kind of key things is actually like Dean points out very concisely how we're incredibly bad at dealing with feedback, you know. I mean, as somebody who loves to edit and hates to receive edits, I know this is true on a micro level, but actually like how we deal with conflict that won't go away. You know, whether that's on a really global scale. One of the things that Winnie is kind of quite careful to do at the beginning is kind of lay out some of the greater stakes. She talks about the clearing of the student encampments on Columbia Lawn in relation to the ongoing genocide in Palestine, and like actually what does this mean in terms of like how do we organize together. But there's also things that we need to do better just in terms of like our own kind of organizing. Like conflict will come up in mutual aid. Why? Because the stakes are very, very high, and that's okay. I think that trying to equip ourselves against the progress is probably where I'd like to see us move.
Now I have to answer it. So thank you. No, that's so important. For me, well, the first thing to say is I didn't imagine I would still be thinking about that the Loiterers Resistance Movement would still be going 20 years later, but it feels like that conversation is always revived. There's been a few times when I thought, oh, there's nothing new to say, but because the city is always changing and there's always new voices or things to uncover, you know, kind of the city is a bit of a palimpsest, really, and we see those layers when we walk. It can be a kind of time travel, but I really want it to be a forward projection as well. And I guess I would say it started as a very, I thought, short-term activist kind of bit, almost actually a bit of respite from people that were just really burnt out. But it has carried on. Obviously, no spoilers, but we haven't stopped gentrification in Manchester. It has indeed accelerated. But I do think at least having some kind of alternatives, those different layers, I don't think that means it's not worthwhile. And I do think, two other things. One is I think there's a massive proliferation of walking. Now, like Dan mentioned it, you know, 20 years ago talking about psychogeography or creative walking or walking art, there weren't a lot of people as active, and now it's massive. And actually Dee, who asked the question, has been really pivotal in that movement as well. So it feels a privilege to be asked. And Dee's in the book as well. She was one of the people I really wanted to interview for it. And finally, I guess I want to say about progress and time. So I find the usefulness of crypt time really important. The fact that we know, and I think of it on a personal but also on a political level, we need to think more in crypt time about things and not static, and many of us have different time frames and different trajectories, and if we just stopped thinking about this incessant progress is always one thing, it would be really, really helpful. And I still, you know, we should be learning crypt theory, or at the very least the social model in schools, because the world would be, I'm convinced, a more a better place in lots of ways. I'll stop there.
We started just a little bit late, so I'm going to allow for one more burning question. And just a reminder, in the interest of time, a question is a single sentence with a question mark at the end. Do we have said, I'm going to go to the front, sorry love, but you can ask your question at the signing afterwards.
Hello. My one sentence question is how, you've touched on all of this in a way already, but how do we tackle these issues of like repatriation, restoration, taking up space, housing, without giving more power or ceding more power to the institutions themselves? Like when we talk about like universities, when we talk about museums, when we talk about public protection or space protection orders, like ceding more power to the council and to the state. Yeah.
So I guess I'll go first. How do we... It was a short question. It was hard to... We didn't get as long to think about the answer. So yeah, I mean, I think a part of how do we, and so the question is, how do we avoid ceding too much power to those institutions? I mean, there are so many ways we could answer that. I mean, let me answer it with language as being important. I mean, we're here, all of us are writing, we're writing and editing, and we're thinking about language. I mean, you mentioned Gaza a moment ago. Think about the term, when I was a student and undergraduate in anthropology, archaeology, I work across what I call the 4 A's, archaeology, anthropology, art, and architecture. We were told that the times we were living in were the post-colonial times. And anyone in this room that would think about using that, we all almost use it maybe sometimes. A lot of people continue to use it. We cannot use that word anymore. Just open a newspaper and you'll see that it is not, this world is not the post-colonial. I mean, you call it late colonialism if you want, if you're hopeful. But in the book I talk about the fact that those arguments over the term go back to conversations that Stuart Hall was having in the late 90s. He liked the term post-colonial. He even said the Second Gulf War was the first example of a post-colonial war. How wrong he was on that, although not on many other things in life. So we need to think about language. We need to think about how we write, and we need to have hope that language, renaming the forms of colonialism. It isn't only settler colonialism. We have this new vocabulary emerging of the extractivist, of the carceral capitalism, of all these other words that we can invent and we can use and learn from each other. Language really matters in terms of how we think about this. We're dealing, in the case of the book I wrote, about a form of colonialism that reached all the way to Edinburgh and to London and Oxford. So it was indeed territorialized forms of violence that moved even into art and culture. So we write back better, I think, or we try to.
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky question. I don't have the solution, but I do trust that the solution can be thought through with other people. I think that there needs to be I think we all have a very complicated, very different relationships to risk at the moment. And I think that one of the things that should be part of any kind of effective organizing political movement is how that risk is shared. So I don't have a solution for it, but I think that we also have to admit that we are in a kind of situation where people are under increasing degrees of pressure, and actually recognizing each other's position, having a bit more kind of compassion for one another is going to be a deep step forward. The fighting together, like one of the things that we talked about was, what should the book be? I mean, the book is called Slamming Doors, so obviously there's a certain degree of anger already in that, but the subtitle is Falling Out and Fighting Back, and it's like that pivot from falling out and fighting back, not sort of repressing, not saying like, no, that can't happen in this group right now, but like it's a bit of a kind of yes and I think that when we understand what risks other people are taking and how we can kind of get on board with that, how we can share it, then we're halfway there.
Yeah, I think yes and is a fantastic way of thinking through. And for me, I don't know, to bring it back to, I guess, walking and space, there are so many different words for walking, and we know that, and we know what they all mean, to stomp or strut or waddle or whatever. These all mean different things. And I think there's a trick about valuing them all at the same time and having your own, however it is that you are walking, to hold in mind and thought that there are other ways to think of things. I think Doreen Massey is really great on that, but I won't go down that enough time. But just, I think the really important thing on space and those kind of public space things is that we act as if we already own it, because in some ways we already do, and as long as it's a collective, we own it. So with the LRM, we have one rule. Well, it's 2 rules, it's 2 sentences, and I feel like these are things that give me hope and that work in practice. So we say that if you're a loiterer, you take care of yourself and each other and the environment we're walking through, and don't be an arse. And intuitively, it works.
It feels like a really beautiful note to end on. So I would just ask everyone to please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, Mason Leaver-Yap, Morag Rose, and Dan Hicks. Thank you all so much for such a generous and inspiring conversation. Signing?
While our wonderful speakers take themselves off stage, I will just let you know the signing table will be over here, so if you didn't get a chance to ask a question and you would like to, then you can find them over there. Also a reminder that we have a pay-it-forward system, so book people before you have put money in the pot. So if you are too broke to buy any of these books and you wanted one, you can have one. Someone gifted it to you. So do make use of it. It's there for you. And also, just because the Roxy are wonderful, I will point out their bar is open. So if you want a drink and to also support the venue, you can do that and have a wonder and a drink, especially if you're sticking around for myths and folklore afterwards. And now you may go be in the world.